Mike Johnson had always been a man of simple habits and practical solutions. After retiring from his long career as an electrical engineer, he decided to make his home as energy efficient as possible. He had always been fascinated by the idea of living off the grid, of cutting ties with the sprawling, profit-driven power companies he had once helped design systems for. So, he invested in a high-efficiency solar power system, installing rows of sleek, black panels on his roof and a set of sturdy, weatherproof batteries in his garage. The system was expensive, but Mike saw it as an investment in his independence, a way to reduce his carbon footprint while also slashing his monthly power bill to nearly zero. For the first few months, the system worked perfectly. Mike's electric meter barely budged, the smooth, quiet hum of his solar batteries a constant, reassuring presence in the background as he went about his daily routines. He took quiet pride in his self-sufficiency, the small, private satisfaction of a man who had spent decades designing systems for others and was now, at long last, reaping the benefits of his own hard work. But then, one warm, breezy afternoon in late spring, Mike noticed something strange. He had been reviewing his monthly utility bill, comparing the numbers to his previous statements as he often did, when he noticed a sharp, unexplained spike in his power usage. At first, he thought it might be a glitch, a misreading of the meter, a faulty connection, perhaps even a software error in his monitoring system. But as the weeks went by, the numbers continued to climb, each month's bill a little higher than the last, the sharp, steady rise in his power consumption as clear and undeniable as the sunlit graphs on his computer screen. Mike frowned, his large, calloused hands tightening around the smooth, polished edge of his desk as he leaned in closer to the screen, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing as he scrolled through the data, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, anxious thoughts. He had designed this system himself, checked and rechecked every connection, every wire, every circuit. There should be no reason, no logical explanation, for this sudden, inexplicable surge in his power usage. He spent the next few days inspecting his system, his large, calloused hands moving with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to solving problems, his sharp, dark eyes scanning each panel, each wire, each connection with the practiced, automatic precision of a veteran engineer. But no matter how hard he looked, no matter how many times he traced the circuits, checked the breakers, and double-checked the connections, he could find no obvious explanation for the mysterious spike in his power consumption. Frustrated and increasingly suspicious, Mike decided to install a few discreet, high-resolution security cameras around his property, their small, black lenses carefully concealed among the thick, leafy branches of his hedges and the tall, narrow columns of his front porch. He set the cameras to record 24/7, their motion-activated sensors programmed to send real-time alerts to his phone whenever they detected movement near his outdoor power outlets. It didn't take long for the cameras to catch something unusual. One afternoon, as Mike sat at his kitchen table, his rough, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the latest round of power usage data on his laptop, his phone buzzed softly against the polished wooden surface of the table, its small, black screen flashing with a new alert from his security system. Frowning, Mike reached for the phone, his thick, calloused fingers tapping the screen as he pulled up the live feed from his front yard. His eyes narrowed as he watched the grainy, black and white footage play out before him. His next-door neighbor, Karen, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied smile as she bent down beside one of his outdoor power outlets, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, weathered metal as she plugged a thick, black power cord into the socket and slipped back through the narrow gap in the hedges that separated their properties, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the smooth, sunlit pavement as she disappeared around the corner of her house. Mike felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he watched the footage, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, furious thoughts as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that his neighbor had been stealing his power. Using his carefully installed, meticulously maintained solar system to charge her bright, shiny new Tesla without his permission. When Mike confronted her the next morning, his large, calloused hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides, Karen simply smiled, her thin, perfectly manicured lips curling into a tight, self-satisfied smirk as she leaned casually against the smooth, polished fender of her car, her sharp, blue eyes flicking dismissively over his broad, muscular frame as she waved a thin, perfectly manicured hand in his direction and insisted that he was imagining things. But when Mike disconnected the cord that afternoon, pulling the thick, black cable free from the weathered, metal outlet and winding it neatly around his thick, calloused hands. He found it plugged back in the next morning, the thin, black wire snaking through the neatly trimmed hedges that lined his property like the twisted, coiled body of a serpent. When he tried to remove it a second time, Karen appeared on his doorstep, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she threatened to report him to the HOA for tampering with her property, her sharp, blue eyes blazing with a cold, vindictive fury as she promised to make his life very difficult if he continued to interfere with her right to use his power. Mike had hoped that confronting Karen would put an end to the petty power theft, but he quickly realized that his neighbor had no intention of backing down. In fact, she seemed to have taken his objections as a personal challenge, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a fierce, determined scowl whenever their paths crossed, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in thinly veiled contempt as she stalked past his house, her polished, designer heels clicking sharply against the cracked, uneven pavement of their shared driveway. But it wasn't until Mike overheard a conversation at the local hardware store that he realized just how far Karen's campaign of petty theft and intimidation had truly spread. He had been standing in the long, slow-moving line at the checkout counter, his large, calloused hands wrapped around the rough, wooden handle of a new pair of bolt cutters, when he caught the faint, familiar sound of Karen's sharp, high-pitched voice drifting over the polished, concrete floor of the store, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she leaned in close to one of their mutual neighbors, a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a faint, nervous twitch in his left eye. "Oh, it's no big deal," she was saying, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, weathered edge of the metal shopping cart as she spoke, her tone dripping with the cold, calculated confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for their actions. Mike's retired. He's got nothing better to do. He should be happy to share his excess power. It's not like he's using it all, anyway. The tall, thin man frowned, his pale, drawn face twisted into a tight, uncomfortable grimace as he glanced nervously over his shoulder, his narrow, beady eyes flicking briefly toward the tall, broad-shouldered figure of Mike as he stood silently a few feet away. His sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled anger as he listened to the conversation with a growing sense of disbelief. And besides, Karen continued, her thin, perfectly manicured lips curling into a tight, self-satisfied smirk as she leaned in closer, her sharp, blue eyes glinting with a faint, malicious gleam as she whispered, "It's not like he can stop us. The HOA's on my side. They'll back me up if he tries to make a fuss. I've got them wrapped around my little finger." Mike felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he clenched his large, calloused fists at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had been encouraging other neighbors to join in her campaign of petty theft, her sharp, polished nails digging into the thin, metal frame of her shopping cart as she whispered her lies, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she imagined herself untouchable, unassailable, above the rules and consequences that governed the lives of ordinary people. When Mike returned home that afternoon, his mind still reeling from the shock and anger of what he had overheard, he decided that enough was enough. He spent the next few hours installing a heavy, weatherproof lockbox around his outdoor power outlets, the thick, metal frame reinforced with a sturdy, tamper-resistant latch and a high-security padlock, the thick, polished steel gleaming softly in the warm, late afternoon sunlight as he tightened the last bolt with a sharp, satisfying twist of his thick, calloused fingers. He stepped back slowly, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property as he admired his handiwork, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the thick, reinforced frame of the lockbox with a quiet, simmering satisfaction as he imagined the look of frustration and disbelief that would spread across Karen's thin, carefully made-up face the next time she tried to steal his power, her thin, polished nails clicking uselessly against the cold, unyielding surface of the hardened steel as she realized, too late, that her days of petty theft and intimidation were over. But the next morning, as Mike stepped out onto his front porch, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, his sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled suspicion as he scanned the neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property. His heart sank as he caught sight of the thick, metal lockbox, its heavy, polished frame twisted, dented, and broken, the thick, steel latch hanging loosely from the shattered remains of the lock, the thin, black power cord, snaking through the narrow gap in the hedges like the twisted, coiled body of a serpent, its smooth, rubber surface glinting softly in the bright, early morning sunlight as it stretched toward the polished, gleaming fender of Karen's shiny, white Tesla. Mike felt his fist clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he stepped off the porch and made his way slowly, deliberately toward the shattered remains of the lockbox, his large, calloused fingers trembling slightly as he reached out and touched the rough, jagged edges of the twisted metal, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had smashed the lockbox with a hammer or a set of bolt cutters, her thin, perfectly manicured hands twisting and wrenching the thick, hardened steel into a twisted, mangled ruin as she plugged her car back in and slipped back through the narrow gap in the hedges, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the smooth, sunlit pavement as she disappeared around the corner of her house. That evening, Mike checked his security footage, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he watched the grainy, black and white footage play out on the small, flickering screen of his laptop. Karen, dressed in all black, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she crept through the narrow gap in the hedges, her long, polished nails glinting softly in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight as she smashed the lockbox with a series of sharp, precise blows, the thin, twisted remains of the shattered latch falling to the ground with a faint, metallic clink as she plugged her car back in and disappeared into the shadows. Mike sat at his kitchen table, the cool, early morning light filtering through the thin, sun-bleached curtains that framed his small, weathered window. His laptop set open before him, the bright, flickering screen casting long, sharp shadows across the polished, wooden surface of the table as he reviewed the security footage from the previous night, his large, calloused hands moving with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to solving problems. He had spent the better part of an hour carefully combing through the grainy, black and white recordings, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he watched Karen smash the lockbox he had installed just days earlier, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she crept through the narrow gap in the hedges, her long, polished nails glinting softly in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight as she swung the hammer with a series of sharp, precise blows, the thin, twisted remains of the shattered latch falling to the ground with a faint, metallic clink as she plugged her car back in and disappeared into the shadows. Mike felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he reached for his phone, his large, calloused fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number for the HOA office. His pulse thundering in his ears as he listened to the faint, distant hum of the ringing line, the cool, artificial tone echoing through the quiet, empty air of his kitchen as he waited for someone to pick up. After a few long, tense moments, the line clicked, and a thin, high-pitched voice crackled through the small, black speaker of his phone, the faint, electronic hiss of the connection crackling softly in the background as the HOA president, a short, thin man named Richard, answered the call. "Hello, this is Richard speaking," the man said, his voice smooth, polished, his tone dripping with the cold, calculated confidence of someone who had grown far too comfortable with the quiet, unchallenged authority of his position. "Richard, this is Mike Johnson," Mike replied, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of his kitchen like a blade, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he leaned in closer to the small, black microphone of his phone, his sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled anger as he continued. "I need to file a formal complaint against my neighbor, Karen. She's been stealing my power, vandalizing my property, and violating multiple HOA guidelines. I have video evidence, clear, undeniable proof, that she's been trespassing on my property, smashing my lockbox, and plugging her Tesla into my outdoor outlets without my permission." For a long, tense moment, the line fell silent, the faint, electronic hiss of the connection crackling softly in the background as Richard hesitated, his thin, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of his phone as he considered his response. Finally, Richard cleared his throat, his thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as he leaned back in his high-backed, leather office chair, the polished, black leather creaking softly beneath his narrow, angular frame as he replied. "Look, Mike," he said, his voice low, hesitant, his tone carefully measured as he chose his words with the careful, deliberate precision of a man walking a tightrope over a pit of snapping, snarling wolves. I've known Karen for years. She's a respected member of this community, a generous, upstanding neighbor, a dedicated volunteer. I find it hard to believe that she would do something like this. Are you sure you're not just overreacting? I mean, maybe this is just a misunderstanding, a simple case of miscommunication. Mike felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he struggled to keep his voice calm, his large, calloused hands tightening around the thin, polished edge of his kitchen table as he leaned in closer to the small, black microphone of his phone. His sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled anger as he replied. Misunderstanding, he growled, his deep, dark voice trembling with barely contained fury as he continued. I have video evidence, Richard. Clear, undeniable proof that Karen has been trespassing on my property, vandalizing my lockbox, and stealing my power. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft, pure and simple. Richard hesitated for a brief, telling moment, his thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as he considered his response, his thin, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of his phone as he chose his words with the careful, deliberate precision of a man trying to defuse a bomb. Look, Mike, he said finally, his voice low, hesitant, his tone carefully measured as he leaned back in his chair, his thin, angular frame creaking softly against the polished, black leather as he continued. I appreciate your concerns, but this sounds like petty neighbor drama, a personal dispute, not something the HOA should be involved in. I'd advise you to let it go, before you stir up more trouble than you can handle. Mike felt his jaw tighten, his fists clenching into tight, white-knuckled balls at his sides as he listened to Richard's thin, polished voice crackle through the small, black speaker of his phone, his pulse thundering in his ears as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had more allies in the community than he had thought. Her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she whispered her lies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her venomous gossip through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. Over the next few days, Mike began to notice a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way his neighbors treated him. The small, friendly waves and nods he had grown accustomed to over the years were replaced by tight-lipped glares and averted eyes. The quiet, neighborly conversations he once enjoyed now reduced to strained, uncomfortable silences as his once friendly neighbors hurried past his house, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously toward the narrow, gravel path that led to his front door. He heard whispers, faint, murmured accusations carried on the cool, evening breeze as he worked in his garden, the sharp, cutting words of gossip and speculation drifting through the thin, rustling leaves of his carefully cultivated hedges like the whispered hiss of a snake. Busybody. Control freak. Always sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. Mike felt a slow, simmering rage build in his chest, his fists clenching into tight, white-knuckled balls at his sides as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had taken her campaign of petty, vindictive harassment to a whole new level. One that threatened not just his power, but his entire way of life. As the days passed, Karen's campaign against Mike continued to escalate. She had grown bolder, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of her phone as she whispered her venomous lies to the other members of the HOA, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she spread her poison through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. She had convinced herself that she had the upper hand, that Mike was nothing more than a stubborn, meddling old man with too much time on his hands and too few friends to defend him. She had even begun pushing for the HOA to impose fines on him for harassment and inappropriate use of security cameras, her sharp, blue eyes glinting with a faint, malicious gleam as she imagined him forced to sell his beloved home to pay off the mounting, crippling debt of her carefully orchestrated vendetta. But just as Karen prepared to make her final move, to push for the decisive vote that would see Mike fined, humiliated, and driven from the neighborhood for good, she received a piece of mail that would shatter her carefully constructed empire of lies and manipulation. The letter arrived one bright, breezy Monday morning, the thick, crisp, white envelope slipping silently through the narrow, brass slot of her front door and landing with a faint, muffled thump on the polished, marble tiles of her foyer. Karen frowned, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, irritated scowl as she bent to pick it up, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured paper as she turned the envelope over in her hands, her sharp blue eyes narrowing in suspicion as she caught sight of the high-profile law firm's logo stamped across the front in bold, black ink. She tore the envelope open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she unfolded the thick, heavy sheet of crisp, white paper contained within, her sharp blue eyes scanning the densely typed text with a growing sense of dread as she read and reread the letter, her heart sinking with a cold, sinking certainty as the full, horrifying implications of the message began to sink in. It turned out that Mike wasn't just a retired electrical engineer. He was a former energy consultant who had helped design the power grid for the entire county. His decades of experience and deep technical knowledge making him one of the most respected and influential figures in the industry. He had deep ties to local politicians, utility companies, and law enforcement, his quiet, unassuming lifestyle hiding a personal net worth that dwarfed the combined property values of the entire neighborhood. Karen felt her heart skip a beat, her thin, pale lips parting in a silent, gasping breath as the thin, neatly typed lines of the letter seemed to blur before her eyes, her mind reeling with 1,000 silent, frantic thoughts as she realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that she had just declared war on a man with the power, influence, and resources to destroy her life, her reputation, and her carefully cultivated empire of petty, suburban authority. And Mike, it seemed, had finally decided to fight back. The following Thursday, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the narrow, winding streets of the neighborhood crept slowly across the cool, polished marble tiles of the HOA meeting hall. Mike arrived dressed sharply, his tall, broad frame wrapped in a crisp, dark suit, the sharp, clean lines of the tailored fabric hugging his powerful, well-defined shoulders as he strode through the double doors and into the cool, brightly lit foyer of the building, his polished, black leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished, white marble tiles as he made his way slowly, deliberately toward the front of the room. The room fell silent as he entered, the faint, nervous whispers of the assembled crowd fading into a tense, strained stillness as the members of the HOA turned to stare at him, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously toward the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that Mike carried in his large, calloused hands, the thick, polished leather creaking softly against the smooth, polished surface of the podium as he set it down with a sharp, satisfying thump. Mike cleared his throat, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of the room like a blade as he began to speak, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as his sharp, dark eyes scanned the assembled crowd, his broad, muscular frame radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I have come here tonight to address the numerous, baseless accusations that have been leveled against me by your HOA president, Karen Miller." A faint, nervous murmur rippled through the crowd, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously between Mike's tall, imposing frame and the sharp, angular features of their once loyal leader, her pale, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the polished, white marble tiles as she crossed and uncrossed her long, slender legs. Mike calmly presented his evidence, including security footage, utility bills, and legal notices detailing Karen's theft, vandalism, and harassment. He hinted at a looming civil lawsuit for property damage, theft, and emotional distress, his deep, dark voice ringing out through the still, silent air of the room, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he laid out his case, his large, calloused fingers flipping through the thick, leather-bound stack of documents with the practiced, automatic precision of a man accustomed to control, to power, to authority. As he finished, the room fell into a tense, strained silence, the faint, nervous whispers of the assembled crowd replaced by a quiet, stunned stillness as the members of the HOA, suddenly realizing their exposure, began to distance themselves from Karen's, their once loyal ally, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes flicking nervously toward the sharp, angular features of their former leader, her carefully cultivated empire of suburban control crumbling beneath the relentless, crushing weight of the truth. A week after the explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood had settled into a tense, uneasy silence. The whispered gossip and nervous, furtive glances that had once defined life on the quiet, tree-lined streets had been replaced by a strained, uncomfortable stillness. The once friendly waves and nods of Mike's neighbors now reduced to tight-lipped, averted eyes and awkward, sidelong glances as they hurried past his house, their faces pale and drawn, their nervous, whispered conversations echoing faintly through the cool, early morning air as they scurried down the narrow, gravel paths that lined the edge of his property. Mike, for his part, had returned to his quiet, unassuming routine, his large, calloused hands moving with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to solving problems as he tended to his garden, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the long, neatly trimmed rows of sunflowers and hydrangeas that lined the edge of his front lawn, their tall, swaying stalks casting long, twisted shadows across the sunlit grass as the warm, late afternoon breeze rustled through their brightly colored petals. But even as he went about his daily chores, his mind remained sharp, focused, his thoughts never straying far from the petty, vindictive woman who had declared war on his peace and quiet, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she whispered her lies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her poison through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. He had not forgotten the many small, petty acts of theft and vandalism that had marked the long, bitter months of their conflict. The sharp, stinging pain of each shattered lockbox, each stolen watt of power, each whispered, malicious lie a constant, nagging reminder of her petty, vindictive nature and her utter disregard for the rights and boundaries of others. So, when Mike had finished laying out his case at the HOA meeting, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of the room as he presented his thick, leather-bound stack of documents, his large, calloused fingers flipping through the neatly typed pages with the practiced, automatic precision of a man accustomed to control, to power, to authority, he had made one final, quiet addition to his carefully planned, meticulously executed campaign of quiet, unassuming revenge. He had installed a small, carefully concealed power surge device on the outdoor outlet that Karen had been stealing from, the thick, polished metal casing gleaming softly in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight as he tightened the last bolt with a sharp, satisfying twist of his thick, calloused fingers, the small, blinking red light of the device casting a faint, ominous glow across the dark, shadowed grass of his front lawn as he stepped back slowly, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, polished surface of the driveway. The device, which Mike had designed and built himself, was a simple but effective piece of technology, a small, weatherproof box containing a carefully calibrated power surge circuit, its thick, insulated wires wrapped tightly around the main power line of his outdoor outlet, their thin, polished copper strands glinting softly in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight as he carefully secured the cover and locked the small, metal latch with a sharp, satisfying click. The purpose of the device was simple: to fry the battery of any unauthorized vehicle that attempted to draw power from his outlet without permission. Its small, blinking red light a silent, unspoken warning to anyone foolish enough to trespass on his property. Its carefully calibrated circuitry designed to detect and destroy any unauthorized connection. Its thin, polished copper strands humming softly with the quiet, deadly promise of retribution as it waited, silently, patiently, for its first victim. A week later, as Mike sat on his front porch, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, his sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled satisfaction as he watched the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property stretch slowly across the cool, sunlit grass, his phone buzzed softly against the rough, weathered wood of the small, low table that sat beside his rocking chair, its small, black screen flashing with a new alert from his security system. Frowning, Mike reached for the phone, his thick, calloused fingers tapping the screen as he pulled up the live feed from his front yard. His eyes narrowed as he watched the grainy, black and white footage play out before him. Karen's bright, shiny white Tesla rolling slowly, deliberately into the narrow, gravel driveway of her house. Its sleek, polished frame gleaming softly in the warm, late afternoon sunlight as she slipped the long, black power cord into the narrow gap in the hedges that separated their properties and plugged it into his outdoor outlet. For a brief, fleeting moment, nothing happened. The faint, rhythmic hum of the Tesla's electric motor blending smoothly with the quiet, whispering rustle of the wind through the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property. Then, suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, its sleek, polished frame shuddering violently as a thin, faint plume of white smoke began to rise from the narrow gap between the polished, chrome fender and the thick, black rubber of the front tire. The thin, curling tendrils of smoke twisting slowly, lazily into the cool, early evening air as the car's engine sputtered, choked, and died, its smooth, polished surface falling silent as the small, blinking red light of the power surge device cast a faint, ominous glow across the cool, shadowed grass of Mike's front lawn. Weeks later, Karen received a thick, certified letter from a local courthouse, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from Mike, seeking damages for theft, property damage, and emotional distress. The HOA, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, voted unanimously to remove Karen as president, stripping her of her power and leaving her once pristine reputation in ruins. Her neighbors, finally seeing her for the bully she is, shun her completely, and her carefully cultivated empire of suburban control crumbles beneath the weight of her exposed lies.